welcome to the show, Our Democracy, The CJR Show. In this show, we will discuss questions of democracy, governance, elections, and other topical issues in Guyana and occurrences in countries around the world. We hope the show will be of interest to everyone. So let's begin the show. Good day. Welcome to another in the series, Our Democracy, The CJR Show. Today is Saturday, April 12, 2025. Today, I will be sharing with you the continuing repercussions and reverberations as regards the U.S. reciprocal trade tariffs and what I have discerned in trade jargon as countermeasures that some countries have resorted to in response to the reciprocal tariffs proposed by the U.S. on the world's trading nations. In their response, I have discerned two distinct approaches. One approach is to negotiate deals bilaterally with the United States in the hope of lowering the U.S. imposed tariffs. The other is to retaliate by equalizing the tariff level imposed by the U.S. In respect to the first group, who I shall call the negotiating countries, none have been able to launch negotiations as yet with Washington, although implementation of the tariffs has been put on pause for 90 days, principally to facilitate the cutting of deals between the U.S. and the countries affected, who are keen to maintain market access to the U.S. in exchange for whatever the U.S. may be demanding as a quid pro quo. Guyana is one of the negotiating countries. Government, that is the government of Guyana, has confirmed that it is, quote, engaged in ongoing discussions with U.S. officials, while CARICOM has, quote, appealed, unquote, to the U.S. President for trade dialogue and for fairer treatment for Caribbean nations. For its part, the Guyana government stated that 10% tariff, quote, matters because it will have a bigger impact on the livelihoods, especially of people in the agriculture sector, in jobs, income, and stability, end of quote. The other countries, who we shall call the non-conforming countries, have retaliated by enforcing their own tariffs to counter the imposed tariffs of the United States in goods. This is called a countermeasure. Its aim is to reciprocate by blocking goods, quote-unquote, made in America from entering the market of the non-conformist country. As regards negotiations, a top U.S. official is reported as saying that 70 countries have called Washington to negotiate trade deals. At the same time, the U.S. President posted on Truth Social that he met with representatives or had calls with several countries. Thus far, I have not seen any concrete evidence of any successful effort to meet with U.S. officials by those who are prepared to negotiate or by those who have retaliated. There appears to be a standoff on all three sides. Nevertheless, let's take a look at those countries who have retaliated in kind. First, let's take a look at China. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, quote, the U.S. practice of escalating tariffs on China is a mistake on top of a mistake, which seriously infringes on China's legitimate rights and interests, seriously damages the rules-based multilateral trading system, end of quote. It should be recalled that the US slapped a whopping 145 tariffs on Chinese goods destined for the US market. In response, China has imposed a tariff of 125% on US imports to China. To counter this measure, according to newspaper reports, quote, China has been ratcheting up its tariffs and will no doubt continue to do so every time the US raises theirs. China has already responded by imposing an 84% tariff on all American goods desirous of entering China. China emphasized that the US, quote, reciprocal tariffs not only violated core principles of the World Trade Organization, but undermined the international trade order and eroded the foundation of the multilateral trading system. In response, China has taken firm action to protect its legitimate rights and to defend global fairness and justice, end of quote. Depending on the American government's response to China, and because China is unlikely to bend to American pressure, the trade war between the world's largest economies of the two most powerful nations is likely to escalate. In the meanwhile, according to reliable sources, quote, the China Film Administration announced that it would begin reducing the number of American films shown in Chinese theaters, end of quote. And ABC News reported that, quote, the move was framed as a direct response to tariff pressures that saw an increase in levies on Chinese imports of 145%, which includes duties that were implemented in February. The end result of the US-China tariff escalation is a virtual economic blockade on each other. Now let's look at what's happening in the European theater. According to Bloomberg, the retaliatory tariffs imposed by the EU on the US will affect around 23.2 billion in US exports to Europe and are in response to the steel and aluminum tariffs. A statement issued by the EU Commission said, quote, the EU considers US tariffs unjustified and damaging, causing economic harm to both sides as well as the global economy. The statement went on to add that, quote, the EU has stated its clear preference to find negotiated outcomes with the US which would be balanced and mutually beneficial, end of quote. Now let's take a look at America's northern neighbor, Canada. For its part, Canada applied a 25% import tax on American-made vehicles. It appears that those tariffs, like the US counterparts, excludes the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is called USMCA automobiles. According to the Canadian Prime Minister, quote, we are responding today with carefully calibrated and targeted counter tariffs, end of quote. As for the Indian subcontinent, India has recognized the reciprocal US tariffs as a matter of priority. And as a consequence, the Indian government has adopted a twin-track approach. On the one hand, it is seeking to conclude an interim trade agreement with the US that would hopefully mitigate the proposed 26% reciprocal tariff on India, while on the other hand, India prepares to be offering assurances that its problematic nuclear liability law will be amended to permit US nuclear reactor exports to India. Now let's look at Brazil in South America. Brazil's response to the reciprocal US tariffs. According to news reports, Brazil's Congress on Wednesday passed a bill that allows the government to impose reciprocal trade and environmental measures against foreign restrictions. Just hours after US President Trump announced a new 10% tariff on all Brazilian imports. The bill approved in the Chamber of Deputies a day after clearing the Senate, now awaits presidential ratification. It was fast-tracked through both houses with support from lawmakers across the political spectrum. However, Brazilian officials have warned that Brazil remains open to dialogue with Washington, but is prepared to pursue all legal and diplomatic avenues, including WTO compliant, to defend its economic interests. As regards Japan, reports indicate that Japanese government officials have been in talks with the US president. According to the report, Japan is seeking to negotiate down the 24% tariff that the US is set to charge on Japanese imports. Interestingly, the US has imported some 148.2 billion worth of goods from Japan. Ironically, the US has now slapped a reciprocal tariff of 24% for Japanese goods entering the United States. Japan has begun to sell off US Treasury bonds with the hope of placating Washington to ease the harsh tariffs. Still in Southeast Asia, let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam's first attempt to cut a deal with the US was turned down. However, this did not deter nor discourage the Southeast Asian nation to continue to press for negotiations with the US. As regards developments on the Korean Peninsula, it was reported that the president had a great call with South Korean acting president and prime minister. However, no commitments were made by the US side. Another long-standing ally of America was apparently given the cold shoulder. And so the drama and the saga on a global scale stemming from America's new foreign trade policy continues. We wait with bated breath the outcome of the request by countries to enter into negotiations with the US. At the same time, we will continue to observe how the retaliatory countermeasures by other affected nations will play out. However, what is clear is that, as I said before, the world of globalization has come to an end. Now let's look at what's happening in Guyana on the political front. Opposition political parties in Guyana continues to haggle as though in the marketplace over how to share the spoils of government should they win the next election due to be held in Guyana this year, 2025. The premature back and forth negotiations between the political opposition over the sharing of the spoils if they manage to win government makes a mockery of the highly complex and sensitive political question of power sharing negotiations, which they seem to know nothing about, nor have they learned from previous attempts at getting together the motley group of anti-PP and anti-democratic political has-beens. The process more resembles a rum shop or cake shop modus operandi by an ensemble of disparate aspirants with completely different philosophical, ideological, and political outlooks and interests. For its part, the opposition People's National Congress Reform, led a Partnership for National Unity, continues to insist that it must have the nominee for the presidential candidate, while the Alliance for Change continues to jockey for the top job as well. This bazaar-type haggling at this point in time is about sharing of seats in the National Assembly and the composition of cabinet as per ministerial appointments. Observers say that because of the jaded nature of the deep self-interest that characterize the jockeying between the two sides, there is absolutely no public interest whatsoever in what has turned out to be a masquerade disguised as negotiations. Not surprisingly, the political diminutive combatants have failed to recognize that what the public has a keen interest in is a programmatic platform of the political opposition, rather than internal tussling as to who gets what when there is not even a clear pathway for the opposition to win the upcoming elections. It has to be recalled that prior to the national elections held in October 92, the opposition political parties formed the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy, PCD, to champion badly needed electoral reforms, but most importantly, a joint programmatic platform that would reflect the interests of the Guyanese people, as well as the aims and objectives of the PCD. Work proceeded in earnest to formulate the programmatic platform. A consultative process was initiated with the parties in the PCD. The document was completed and agreed by all. The PPP then proposed that the document be publicized and be widely circulated for all to see and to make comments. However, the WPA objected on the ground that a consensus presidential candidate must be settled before the joint program is made public. On this, there was no agreement. The process ended there. There's a strong possibility that the topsy-turvy talks between the opposition political parties will end with no agreement on a consensus presidential candidate, and by implication, that will signal no effort to formulate a joint program. In the meanwhile, the political opposition continues to flog three dead horses in an attempt to create an apocalypse of the Guyana electoral system, with respect to biometrics, the so-called bloated voters list, and verification of addresses of registrants, while at the same time hurling attacks on the chairman of the Guyana Elections Commission and the Commission itself as incompetent and unfit to fulfill its constitutional mandate, simply because the Commission would neither kowtow nor bend to the whims and fancies of the political opposition. Let me be clear, the political opposition will not succeed. The struggle continues for the strengthening of our national democracy, with free and fair elections as a core principle, inextricably bound up with the best and modern practices of good governance. This brings us to the end of today's show, during which I have shared with you two very important matters. The first, treating with reverberations and repercussions stepping from the U.S. foreign trade policy concerning reciprocal tariffs, and secondly, where I provided you with an insight to developments on the political situation in Guyana as it prepares for elections 2025. I hope you have benefited from this show, and I look forward to meeting with you once again next Wednesday, April 16, 2025 at 5 p.m. Goodbye.